Hi, my name's Chris, and this is the first video in a tutorial series covering the modular firearm system in NeoFPS. This series will go through a range of different topics, from the basics of what the modular firearm system is and does, through to individual videos on the different types of modules that you can use, and videos on individual features as well, things like overheating or scopes and optics. Now what this means is that there's going to be some pretty large and chunky videos as we cover more in-depth topics, but there's also going to be a lot of smaller videos. Now the reason that I've done this is so that as the modular firearm system evolves, like new features are added, or occasionally features that exist are extended or have to change, I should only need to replace individual videos rather than having to redo the entire tutorial series. But it also will contribute towards making it easier for you to find the information that you need as you're creating them. So this first video is covering the modular firearm system as a whole, what it is, what it does, and the modular firearm component that ties it all together. After the documentation, we're going to be looking at moving modules out of the root firearm object into swappable sub-objects, and finally taking a look at what other components you should expect to see on a modular firearm. Okay, so first up, let's have a look at the modular firearm component itself. So here I have opened the Firearm Pistol Quick Switch prefab, which you can find in NeoFPS Samples, Shared, Prefabs, Weapons, Quick Switch Inventory. So here we have the modular firearm component. On this up top are a number of properties. First up, requires wielder. So this is asking, does the firearm need to be in somebody's inventory in order to exist? This has two reasons. First up, so that if you're creating the firearm in a scene, the prefab, and you leave it in the scene accidentally when you start playing, you don't want the firearm there, taking input, shooting away whilst you're running around separately to it. The other reason is that you can actually use modular firearms outside of the character inventory. You can do things like the turrets in the jetpacks and guided missiles demo, or you can add them to AI, or you could place them on vehicles. All that you need to do to make that work is to actually point the firearm at something and use a script to tell it when to trigger. Underneath the wielder we have the animation section. So we have the animator for the firearm itself. So if I click that, you can see that this is the view model right here. This is the actual FBX that we have for this weapon dropped in here, and it has an animator controller attached. We have a fire animation trigger, which is called whenever the gun actually shoots. Now these animator trigger parameters here, they're strings, so they relate to the animator on the weapon. If we just open this up quickly, you can see in the parameters we have a trigger parameter called fire. So going back here, these parameters in the modular firearm component or in any of the modules are set up such that they will let you know if they are valid. So valid includes blank. So what this means is that there will just not be an animation in this situation. Or if we try typing something in and it's not found on the animator controller, it will let us know with an error. Parameter with matching name is not found. So in this case, we know it's called fire, so as soon as we do that, the error goes away, everything is fine. And the pose transform is used for holding the weapon in different poses. 99.9% of the time, this is just going to be the root of the firearm object. So you can essentially ignore that. And it will be set automatically when you first create the firearm. Next up, we have a section on accuracy. So 0 accuracy speed is the speed that when you're moving at this speed, your accuracy will be 0. So if you're sprinting, you're not going to be deadly accurate with your weapon. Next, we have move accuracy damping. So what this means is that as you're, say, tapping A and D, strafing quickly left and right to make yourself hard to hit, you don't want the accuracy going like full 0, full 0, full 0 quickly. So this adds just a little damping element. So as you quickly change your movement velocity, it doesn't instantly shrink and grow the crosshair. Below that we have air accuracy. So that is how accurate you are, multiplier 0 to 1, whilst you're in mid-air. Okay, next up we have raise and lower. So this is the actions that happen when you actually select the weapon in your inventory, or deselect and select a different one. So we have the raise delay type. Gives you none, so instant, elapsed time, so we set an amount of time between starting to raise the weapon and actually being able to use it, and external trigger. So external trigger means you need a script to tell it you're ready to use now, which in a lot of cases is going to be an animation event on the animations of the weapon themselves. But all of the NeoFPS demos use the raise duration just because it's nice and simple. Again, we have the animator triggers, so this will give you an error if this is not a valid one on the animator controller of the weapon. Again, you can also leave it blank, which means no animation will be played. Let's go back to what it was. Similarly, the lower animation trigger is the trigger that's used on the animator controller to start the lowering animation. Leaving that blank in this situation because it's nice quick snappiness to be able to just quickly switch between different weapons and instantly pull them out. So deselect duration of 0 to go with that. Audio. So audio-wise, we just have, on the modular firearm component, the dry fire, which is the clicking noise you get when you fire with no ammunition, and the weapon raise sound, and weapon volume. The weapon volume will affect every single noise that's played by the weapon, so gunshots, reloading audio, things like that. Those are all triggered on the actual modules themselves, but this will control it as the master volume. Lastly, we have origin point match transform. So the origin point of a NeoFPS firearm is the camera. You can see here with the weapon selected, we've got the origin just here. That is where the camera will sit whilst you're in first person. So in some cases, with some different assets, art assets, for example, you might find that the origin of the weapon is something like the feet of the character, because it's using a humanoid rig. Or it might be in, well, a relatively random position or a different rotation because the art package uses a different coordinate system, things like that. In those situations, when you first start using a view model of that weapon, you're going to find that the firearm's pointing in a random direction when you first enter the game. So what this actually does here is it lets us choose an object in the hierarchy to say this is the camera. We drop it in here and it will reposition the view model so that it aligns everything so that the camera is at the origin. So in this case, for the NeoFPS demo weapons, you don't actually need to do this. But when we look at the low poly FPS later on, when we're setting up a firearm, you'll actually find that this is quite useful. It doesn't actually store the transform of the camera here. It's a one-time thing. You drop in a transform and it will realign everything and then just be blank again. So at the bottom of the modular firearm component, we have this section here. This is the meat of the system. This is the individual modules attached to this firearm right now. So each of these modules is a component on the firearm. So for example, we have hit scan shooter here. That's the top one on the list here. We have weapon move aimer here. Top one on the list there. So you can add these modules from here. Or of course, because they're just components, you can add them here. Weapon move aimer, for example. So this drop down will provide you with all of the valid modules of that type. Click one and it will just add it. Ballistic shooter, for example, will add it down here. Now you can have multiple of each module on the weapon, but only one can be active at any one time. So here, this new one that we've added, we're getting an error saying too many shooter modules active on start. So what this means is you need to pick one to be the active one, and then you need to tick off active on start here for the others. And that's got rid of that error. So now we just have, again highlighted, one or more shooter modules has an error. So if we look at it, you can see projectile prefab requires a value, muzzle tip requires a value. So if we wanted to, we could just select a random projectile and select the muzzle tip, for example. There it is. And there we go. Errors are gone here, errors are gone there. And you'll see that we have one of these is highlighted and the other one isn't. So the highlighted one is the one that's going to be active using that start active tick box. And the other one isn't. So let's just remove that. And let's go through the individual module types and just have a quick overview of what each of them does. So the shooter modules define what actually happens when you fire the weapon. It's what the firearm emits. So for example, the ballistic shooters. We have ballistic, pattern ballistic, simple ballistic, and spread ballistic. Each of those emits a projectile, or multiple projectiles. And then we have hit scan, pattern hit scan, spread hit scan. So those simply instantly raycast between them. The actual effect of hitting something using those shooters is then delegated to another module. Next up, we have the trigger modules. So these define the responsiveness and the frequency of shots by this firearm. So for example, an automatic trigger is like a machine gun, semi-auto is what's used on this pistol here, so it's single shot. Next up, the aimer modules. So this is what happens when you aim down sights. So that could be anything from triggering an animation, it could be moving the weapon to align it with the camera, or it could be moving the camera to align it with the weapon. Reloader modules. This is how ammo is stored within the gun itself, so the magazine of the weapon, and how it reloads. So it could be a more complicated chambered reloader that has a bullet in the chamber and a magazine full of bullets. It could be a simple reloader, so it's just a magazine of bullets. It could be an incremental one, like a shotgun, where you put in one shell at a time as you reload, and you can interrupt it. Ammo is the pool that ammo is drawn from by the reloader. So it can be inventory-based, like the shared pool ammo, or it could be completely custom to this weapon. So the ammo effect is what happens when the gun actually hits something. So in most cases, that's probably going to be a bullet ammo effect, so deals a bit of damage, applies some force. We also have advanced versions of that for things like randomized damage or damage fall-off based on speed. We have ricochet, penetration, explosions, all kinds of things. So the recoil handler defines how firing a weapon is reflected in its movement, in its recoil. This affects both the position, animation of the weapon, as well as the accuracy of the weapon. So your crosshair can grow, for example, and your weapon becomes less accurate as you recoil. The muzzle effect is visual and audio effects for the actual gunshot itself. So this could be audio only for something like a crossbow, or it could be a very complicated particle system ammo effect, flames and smoke and sparks and all kinds of things. And then lastly, the shell ejector modules are how, when you fire it, ejects the empty casing of a round out there. So it could, for example, just throw out a rigid body, could use a particle system, or it could swap objects within the animated view model with a physics object and then re-enable it later on. And that's that. So all of those modules work together to model the way that a firearm behaves. Now, if you want to actually go through those individual modules, then there will be videos that cover each of the different types here. But you can also go to the firearm documentation. It's quite detailed and has references for all the different components, as well as overviews of what different things mean. So at the top of this module section here, you'll see the Modular Firearms documentation. And if we click that, that takes us to docs.neofps.com. And this section here, Modular Firearm System, this covers the actual overview, what we've been talking about already, along with the various different modules and components. So we have the different modules here, references for each one. We have hit scan versus projectiles and guided projectiles. We've got scopes and optics, and we have simple attachments. The reference itself, so if we pick one that we know is on this pistol here, which would be the hit scan shooter, for example. So this breaks down the component on the weapon, all of the different properties on it, what they mean, occasionally links to different pages, so you can see what those are. So you can find that within here, going through the actual references, but also, if we go back to the weapon itself, and we find the hit scan shooter module, and you can see the little question mark here, this will open up that specific page. So every component in NeoFPS, unless I've missed one, has a reference page to go with it. So if you're looking at any of the demo weapons, the characters, different features within the different demo scenes, things like that, then every one of those should have one of these question marks, and clicking it will take you to the relevant page in the documentation, so you can get a bit of info on how it works. Okay, now that we've looked at where to find information on the different parts of the firearm system, let's dig a bit deeper and look at how we can combine modules to enable new and unique functionality. One of the really big features is that you can have multiple firearm modules of each type on a weapon. Only one can be active at any one time, but you can have as many as you like, and you can switch between them at runtime. Plus, they don't actually need to be on the root of the firearm, they can be on child objects. So, with the demo facility here, let's have a quick look at what kind of behavior that enables. So here we have an assault rifle. Let's just get rid of the highlight. And you can see in the bottom right it says full auto. So that's because we have the automatic trigger set up. So if I fire away, full auto. But if I hit the weapon switch, we now switch to a semi-auto trigger. And what that's done is it's disabled the full automatic trigger module, and it's enabled the semi-auto trigger module. And click again, and we get the burst fire. Similarly, if we switch to pistol, exact same thing happens. You can switch between automatic and semi-automatic. Now, it's not just trigger modules that can change. Literally any module can be swapped like that. So, for example, here with the sniper rifle, we have a render target scope using the weapon move aimer module, but you can switch modes and switch to this red dot sight. So yeah, let's have a look at exactly how that's set up. So if we open the demo facility pistol, keeping with the pistol theme from the first one that we looked at for the firearms, and you can see here in the trigger groups that we actually have quite a few different ones in there. The one that's highlighted, so the one that's the starting state, is the semi-auto trigger. And you can see in here the brackets. This means that this module is actually on a child object. And you can click the eye here, and it will ping the different object that it's on. So we can go through, you can see. So here, for example, this trigger group semi-full auto, this object has both a semi-automatic trigger module and an automatic trigger module. The semi-autos start active, and the automatic one isn't. Then it uses what's called a mode switcher, firearm mode switcher, to switch between the two of them. So that enables you to do all kinds of interesting behavior. You can swap out the type of ammunition in the gun, so the different damages it does, like explosive versus bullet. You can swap out your aimers, so you can have canted sights on scopes. You can swap out your recoil patterns and your muzzle effects. So for example, if you stick a silencer on a gun, you change the sounds to silent sounds and you reduce the damage, you reduce the recoil. So all kinds of things like that. Another thing that you can do is you can actually change these at runtime. So let's hit play again, and we're going to have a look at a specific weapon. Let's get rid of that highlight, and let's head over here and grab the revolver. Now if we go and we aim just so we're looking at the little heart marker there on the target. Actually, let's come out of maximize. Then this character here, where are we? There we are, that's the one. This is the player character. So let's scroll down and find the inventory on here. There it is. Item root, this is where the objects are stored within the character inventory. And here's the revolver that we're holding in our hands right now. So one of the neat things is that you can swap out these modules at runtime. When we were switching fire modes previously, that was one of the built-in methods to do it. But you can swap it loads of different ways. So for example, you could actually, if you wanted to, create your own attachment system, allowing you to swap different weapon components at runtime. So the revolver here, for example, has a number of different optics on it. So let's just make one slight tweak to the ones we've got, which is these modules here, where they have the start active, they also have the activation mode. So what this means is that when the module becomes active, it enables the component, and when it becomes inactive, it disables the component. So in this case, let's switch that to game object. So what it means is that when the firearm module becomes inactive, it will disable the whole object, since these are separate objects within the hierarchy. Let's go through and do that for each of the different optics on here. Is it? There we go. So now you can see that we're still aiming at the heart. Let's make that a little bit bigger. And now, if we swap the module, then you can see that it changes in the view, and the the aim offset changed so that now the camera is still aligned to aim at exactly the same point. Same if we go for the red dot. The firearm moved, the zoom changed. There we go. Go to the iron sights. So for example here, we could modify the iron sight so the FOV multiplier is at 1. And now if we switch to something else and then switch back to it, you can see it changes the zoom. So there you go. That's one cool thing that we can do. Now another massive benefit, if we come out of here, let's go for one of the other demo scenes. And we're going to look at the firing range scene, which is the first one in the list here. Now what we have is just the very basic demo weapons that come with NeoFPS. So the assault rifle here. Notice how the muzzle effect that it uses basically activates this flare geometry object and deactivates it very, very quickly. So it's a very kind of low poly stylized look, but we can do more than that. So if we find, where are you, in shared, where is it? Quick switch, assault rifle, that's this one. So let's get rid of, collapse the hierarchy on that, and if we look on the root, then you see we have got a basic game object muzzle effect. So we can find that, there it is. And we can just remove that component entirely. And what we can do to speed things up is we've got realistic muzzle flashes. So this is the one that's used in the demo facility. And this actually has everything required for the muzzle flash contained on one object. So we look at the weapon object here and we drag that into it. And that will line it up. So now all we need to do is we hit play. Not all we need to do actually, because we do still have the old muzzle flash, wherever that is. Let's hide that. That was hidden automatically by the old basic game object. There we go. We've now switched to a much more interesting flaming realistic muzzle effect, which also adds things like persistence. So if you see the smoke in front of the gun there, we can switch weapons and it stays persistent. So yeah, that's one of the massive boosts of the modular system. Now, let's wrap up by having a look at the remaining components that you might find on a modular firearm, that you'll find on most of them, to be honest. So, we've looked at all of the different modules, just to see what they are, or the different module types anyway. So if we collapse all of these down, then the big ones that you're going to see are the input firearm. So this essentially ties into NeoFPS's input system, so the rebinding that you see in the in-game menus or the in the NeoFPS Hub's input manager. So this is a separate component to the actual firearm itself. So what that means is that you can replace it entirely. You could write a rewired input system or new Unity input system input handler. All it needs to do is just send the trigger down and the reload controls to the firearm, and it will do the rest for you. The next thing, which we had a look at briefly, is the inventory wieldable component. So this is the one that's used to class this object as an inventory item that you can pick up and use. So this has various events on it that you can use to trigger animations and things like that, or to tie into different components. The ID is one of the key things for actually identifying it within your inventory and within the inventory database. Quick slot is the number that you use to select it. Maximum quantity, in the case of wieldables, is generally going to be 1, but for example, something like a hand grenade, you might want a max quantity of 3, 5, something like that. And then the deselect action is very rarely going to be changed. Deactivating the game object is what you want. Some of the NeoFPS users have been attempting different third-person modifications to NeoFPS. This is just a setting to facilitate things like that by disabling the component and not deactivating the object or various things like that. And lastly, the drop object. This is the item that's dropped when you hit G while you're playing. So we'll have a separate video where we look at those. But here, for example, that essentially has dropped all of the weapons in our inventory. So we can go around and we can pick them back up one by one. And that's where that's specified. Yes, like I said, we'll have a separate video that goes through the inventory, setting up inventory keys and IDs, the different inventory types, and then pickups and drops for the weapons, for the ammunition, for different items like that. The last component that you're frequently going to see on one of these firearms is called the Neo-Serialized Game Object. And what this is used for is tying this firearm into the save system. So for example, if you hit quick save whilst you're playing, then your ammo within the magazine will be stored, your animation progress, if you're reloading something like that, will be stored, whether you're aiming down sights will be stored, so that when you load back in using quick load or through the load menu in the main menu, it will load in exactly the same state that you saved it in. And this is the component that manages that. So the way this works is this looks at child objects, so neo-serialized game objects on the children in the hierarchy. So for example, this assault rifle here has one on the local weapon, which is what handles the spring animation. So here's one, and then one on the actual view model. So this one saves the where are we? Saves the animator, for example. So this saves any NeoFPS components on the weapon. So that includes the firearm, the modular firearm component that involves all of the modules. It can save other components like the animator on the view model and various things like that. A lot of it's done automatically for you. For example, you don't need to tell it to save any of the individual components on the same object, but you can, if you really want to, disable it. So for example, here we've got a filter that says we want to exclude these specific components. So these are the valid ones on this object right now. Now, if you were to create a new firearm using the wizard or quick setup, this tutorial AK for example, if you were to add that to your game and hit play, then you're going to get a warning in the console stating that you're trying to instantiate a prefab that isn't registered with the save system. So right here on the Neo-Serialized Game Object, you'll see this button saying Register Prefab with Save Game Manager, and another one for registering the prefab with the Scene Save Info. The first means that you'll be able to runtime instantiate the object in any scene at all, while the latter means just the scene that's currently open when you hit that button. So if we just hit that, then that's all that's required. We now have the prefab ID, and the prefab is registered with the Save Game Manager. So now what that means is we can quick save in-game using this weapon, and when we hit quick load, the weapon will load back in exactly the right state. So we've covered quite a lot of ground in this video. Hopefully that hasn't been too confusing and has given you a bit of an understanding of the firearm system as a whole. Next up, we're going to take a look at creating firearms using the modular firearm wizard in the hub. Then we're going to look at the inventory system, creating different pickups and drops for the firearms and for the ammo and things like that. We're going to look at hit scan versus projectile-based firearms. We're going to look at switching firearm modes, so like we were doing earlier, but switching between semi-auto, full auto, or the different scopes. Yeah, we're going to look at various smaller, more specialized features like overheating and the guided projectiles. And we're going to have a bunch of videos that look at the different module types. So yeah, hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video.